Welcome to Team Tiggio Court TV, where we upload videos every single day. So make sure you subscribe to our channel, like our videos, and share our videos.
The phone rang at the local newspaper office, carrying a voice that claimed responsibility for a brutal family slaughter that had just paralyzed the city. It was the winter of 1974, and the residents of Wichita, Kansas were locking their doors twice, checking their closets, and staring out into the dark streets with a new, suffocating kind of fear. A phantom was moving through their quiet neighborhoods, slipping into family homes, and leaving behind scenes of unimaginable horror. But the deepest dread did not come from the shadows outside. The true terror was the slow, creeping realization that this monster was not a drifter or a ghost, but someone who walked among them in broad daylight. He bought groceries at their markets, waved to them from his driveway, and sat quietly in their church pews. The killer was a neighbor, living a perfectly ordinary life, while hiding a terrifying secret right behind his front door. That neighbor was Dennis Rader, a man who spent decades carefully building a flawless disguise of normal, everyday routine. To the outside world, he was a devoted husband, a strict but present father, and a respected leader in his local church. He worked as a compliance officer, enforcing city rules and handing out warnings for overgrown grass or loose dogs. He stood at the front of his congregation on Sunday mornings, leading prayers and organizing community events with a calm, steady hand. This boring, predictable public face was the perfect shield. Behind the neatly trimmed lawn and the pressed suits, Rader was carefully planning out his dark obsessions, keeping detailed notes of his twisted fantasies in hidden folders. He lived two completely separate lives, switching between the helpful community man and a cold, calculating predator whenever he chose. The sheer scale of his everyday deception made him practically invisible to the very people who were hunting him. He did not just want to commit these terrible acts in silence. He wanted a name that would echo in the nightmares of everyone in the city. In his very first letter to the public, he gave himself a title that laid out exactly what he planned to do to his victims. He told the world to call him BTK, which stood for bind, torture, and kill. It was a cold, direct promise of violence that left no room for doubt about his intentions. That three-letter name became a curse word whispered across Wichita. It was not just the physical violence that terrified people, but the cold, mechanical process the name described. It meant the killer took his time, planned his steps, and found joy in total control over another human being. The name itself was a weapon, designed by Rader to spread panic long before he ever stepped foot inside another home. The nightmare began in January 1974 with the brutal taking of the Otero family, 4 lives erased in a single morning inside their own home. Over the next few years, the attacks continued, striking young women who lived alone, turning safe apartments into crime scenes. Each strike was methodical, leaving behind a trail of cut phone lines and shattered lives. The violence was sudden and absolute, tearing huge holes in the fabric of the community. For the families left behind, the grief was a heavy, suffocating weight that never lifted. They were forced to navigate a world that had instantly become dangerous and cruel, mourning loved ones taken for no reason other than a stranger's dark urge. Birthdays and holidays turned into painful reminders of empty chairs at the dinner table. The sudden loss broke families apart, leaving a deep, lasting ache that outlived the initial shock of the headlines. Inside the police department, the pressure was completely unbearable. Detectives worked around the clock, drinking stale coffee, staring at crime scene photos until their eyes burned, and chasing down hundreds of dead-end leads. They were hunting a ghost who left barely any physical trace, a man who seemed to vanish into thin air after every crime. The deep frustration of knowing a killer was walking free ate away at the officers, ruining their sleep and straining their own family lives. As the years dragged on, the files grew thick with dust, and the trail grew agonizingly cold. Investigators retired or passed away, handing off boxes of evidence to a new generation of cops who felt the exact same heavy burden. They carried a quiet, gnawing guilt, feeling as though they were failing the victims and the terrified city that depended on them. The silence of the unsolved case was a constant mocking reminder of their limits. But the silence never lasted forever, because Dennis Rader had a fatal flaw, an overwhelming, desperate need for attention. Whenever the public started to forget his name, he would reach out from the dark, sending letters, poems, and even strange packages to the local news stations and police headquarters. He dropped these items in public mailboxes or left them wedged in library books, always making sure he stayed just out of sight. He craved the spotlight and could not stand the thought of his crimes fading into history. These messages were not the desperate notes of a man feeling guilty. They were the arrogant taunts of a predator showing off his trophies. He included driver's licenses taken from the victims and detailed drawings of the crime scenes, proving he was the true killer. He mocked the police for their blind spots, pointing out clues they had missed and bragging about how smart he was. Every word dripped with a sick pride, revealing a man who believed he was completely untouchable. To Rader, the murders were only half of the experience. The other half was a grand, twisted game of cat and mouse played across the entire city. He loved the rush of walking past a police cruiser, knowing the officers inside were desperately looking for the very man smiling at them from the sidewalk. He viewed law enforcement not as a threat, but as his personal audience, a group of players he could easily manipulate and outsmart. The city of Wichita was simply his personal chessboard. This intense arrogance became the driving force behind every letter he stamped and every package he mailed. He felt a deep burning need to remind the world that he was still out there, still holding the power of life and death in his hands. He treated the media coverage like a personal report card, eagerly reading the morning paper to see how much fear he had caused. It was a dangerous addiction to his own dark fame, one that required him to keep poking the sleeping bear. He made sure that the name he chose for himself stayed carved into the public mind. By constantly signing his letters with those 3 letters, bind, torture, kill, he forced the city to say his name exactly the way he wanted it said. He turned a simple string of words into a brand of terror that commanded front-page headlines and primetime news spots. He was a master of his own dark public relations, carefully managing how his story was told to the masses. For the people of Wichita, seeing those letters in print was like feeling a cold breeze in a locked room. The name became a symbol of absolute vulnerability, a reminder that locked doors and bright porch lights were not enough to stop true evil. Rader drank in this widespread panic, finding deep satisfaction in the way his chosen title made strong men lock their doors and families sleep with baseball bats beside their beds. He fed on the terror he grew from that single cruel name. While the killer played his games with the press, the families of the victims were trapped in a slow, agonizing wait that stretched into decades. They watched the seasons change, watched their children grow up, all while carrying the heavy anchor of an unsolved murder. Every time a new letter arrived at the news station, the old wounds were ripped wide open again, forcing them to relive the worst days of their lives on a public stage. They lived in a cruel state of limbo, denied the basic human need for closure. Their lives became an exhausting cycle of sudden hope, followed by crushing despair. A news report of a fresh clue would spark a brief moment of light, only to fade back into the dark reality of dead ends and unanswered questions. They had to walk through their hometown wondering if the man standing behind them in the checkout line was the monster who destroyed their family. It was a special kind of quiet torture, enduring 30 years of silence while the man who took everything from them continued to live free. Years turned into decades, and the trail of the BTK killer grew completely cold. Detectives hit a wall because the physical evidence they had was simply not enough to point to one specific person. Back then, police lacked the modern tools needed to pull a clear identity from the few clues left behind at the crime scenes. The killer was careful, leaving no obvious fingerprints or easily traceable items that could crack the case wide open. This lack of answers turned the BTK files into a heavy burden for the local police department. The unsolved murders became a dark shadow over the city, a constant reminder of a predator who had slipped through their fingers. Filing cabinets overflowed with dead-end tips and useless leads, turning the investigation into a deeply frustrating waiting game for the detectives who desperately wanted to close it. But while the police waited, Dennis Rader was quietly feeding his own twisted pride. After years of living in the shadows without being caught, a deep and dangerous arrogance began to swell inside him. He started to believe he was completely untouchable, smarter than every detective who had ever tried to track him down. This overwhelming pride became a hunger he could no longer ignore. He did not just want to get away with his terrible crimes. He desperately wanted the world to recognize his dark work. The silence of his normal, everyday life was no longer enough, pushing him to take shocking new risks just to feel that rush of power once again. Looking back, it is clear that Rader's long run of freedom was built on a mix of intense planning and sheer luck. There were moments when investigators were incredibly close, following leads that brushed right past his actual life. He managed to blend into the community perfectly, hiding his dark urges behind the mask of a regular family man and a strict local official. He survived those close calls because he was obsessively careful about his routines, but also because fate simply broke his way time and time again. When police knocked on doors in his neighborhood or checked local records, Rader always managed to stay just outside the spotlight. This string of lucky breaks only fueled his belief that he was a criminal mastermind who could never be touched. Inside the police station, the atmosphere grew heavy every time a new message from the killer arrived. These letters were not just clues. They were direct, cruel attacks aimed right at the detectives working the case. Rader mocked their efforts, leaving puzzles and crude drawings that filled the squad room with a thick, suffocating sense of anger and helplessness. The detectives took these taunts home with them, losing sleep as the killer's mocking words echoed in their minds. It was a brutal psychological game played out in the quiet hours of the night, wearing down the men and women who had sworn to protect the city. The air in the precinct crackled with a desperate, deeply personal need to wipe the smugness away and finally put a face to the monster. While the killer gloated, the world of police work was going through a massive change. Over the 30 years since the first murders, science had taken a huge leap forward, especially in the way experts could look at human biology. What used to be just a tiny, useless drop of fluid could now be mapped out like a unique barcode, revealing exactly who it belonged to. This new tool, known as DNA testing, changed the rules of the game entirely. Investigators realized that the old evidence sitting in their cold storage was suddenly a goldmine of hidden information. The tiny traces the killer thought he had hidden forever were now waiting to speak, offering a fresh, powerful hope to a case that had been frozen in time. Driven by his massive ego, Rader made the one choice that would finally destroy his perfect hiding spot. In 2004, the local newspaper ran a story about the cold case, suggesting the BTK killer had been forgotten or had simply died. Rader could not handle the idea of being ignored, so he decided to reach out again, desperate to prove he was still the one in control. He began dropping new packages around the city, filled with items taken from his old victims and fresh, rambling letters. He wanted to relive his past power, to pull the police back into his twisted maze. But in his rush to show off, he forgot to be careful, stepping right into a trap built by his own need for attention. The killer's ultimate downfall came in the form of a simple, square piece of plastic. Rader sent a purple floppy disk to a local television station, believing he had outsmarted modern technology by deleting his old files. He actually asked the police, through a hidden message, if they could track him using the disk, and the police publicly lied and said no. Rader fell for the lie and sent the disk, handing investigators a clear digital path right to his front door. When computer experts looked at the disk, they easily found hidden data that Rader thought was wiped clean. The disk contained the name Dennis, and it showed a connection to a specific local church, suddenly shrinking the suspect list from thousands of people down to just one building. For the detectives huddled around the computer screen, the discovery was a massive jolt of electricity. After decades of chasing ghosts and hitting dead ends, they finally had a real, solid name staring back at them. The exhaustion of countless late nights vanished in an instant, replaced by a fierce, pounding hope that the end was finally in sight. The room was tense, filled with the quiet realization that they were looking at the man who had terrified their city for 30 years. Every officer felt the heavy weight of the past lift slightly, knowing they were inches away from answering the prayers of the victims' families. The dark, mocking shadow of the killer was finally being dragged into the bright light of day. With the name Dennis and the church connection in hand, police quickly zeroed in on Dennis Rader, the president of the church council. To prove he was the killer, they needed to match his biology to the old crime scenes, but they had to do it without tipping him off. Investigators secretly obtained a medical sample from Rader's daughter, who was away at college, to see if her biology shared a link with the killer's traces. The laboratory results came back with a perfect, undeniable match. The science proved that the DNA found at the terrible crime scenes decades ago belonged to the father of the young woman at the college. In that single moment, the digital clue from the floppy disk and the hard truth of biology locked together, closing the trap on Dennis Rader once and for all. The truth hit the streets of Wichita like a physical blow. For 30 years, the city had locked its doors against a phantom, a faceless monster who hunted in the dark. But when the mask finally slipped, the face underneath was terrifyingly ordinary. He was a husband, a father, a Boy Scout leader, and the president of his church council. People realized they had stood in line next to him at the grocery store. They had shaken his hand at Sunday service. The man who bound, tortured, and killed 10 innocent people was a city compliance officer who wrote tickets for overgrown lawns. The simple, everyday life of Dennis Rader shattered the community's sense of safety, proving that true evil does not always hide in the shadows. The arrest in February 2005 moved with sudden, overwhelming force. A line of police cars boxed in Rader as he drove near his home, ending a 3-decade reign of terror in a matter of seconds. He did not fight back. He simply sat in his car, the architect of so much misery, finally stripped of his power. This was the moment a cold case thawed into reality. The capture brought an immediate, heavy wave of relief to a city that had never forgotten its lost citizens. It was a direct result of a killer who could not stand being ignored, a man whose desperate need for the spotlight handed the police the exact tools they needed to lock him away. Inside the interrogation room, the facade of the mild-mannered church leader vanished. Detectives sat across from Rader and listened as he laid out his crimes with the casual tone of a man reading a grocery list. He did not show anger, and he certainly did not show remorse. He spoke of his victims as if they were simple objects in a twisted project. He detailed his preparation, his waiting, and his brutal acts with a cold, detached precision that left seasoned investigators deeply unsettled. Rader wanted to claim credit for his work, using the interrogation room as his final stage to brag about the lives he had stolen. This overwhelming pride was the exact flaw that brought him down. Rader had gotten away with murder for years, building a false belief that he was simply smarter than everyone hunting him. He thought he could play a cat-and-mouse game with modern law enforcement using the exact same rules he used in the past. His need to be recognized as a master criminal blinded him to his own mistakes. He trusted a floppy disk because he was too arrogant to believe a simple question to the police could be a trap. The killer outsmarted himself, proving that an inflated ego is often the heaviest anchor a criminal can tie around their own neck. The aftermath of his arrest left a deep, complex scar on Wichita. The immediate terror was gone, but the betrayal lingered in the air. Neighbors had to learn how to look at each other again without wondering what secrets hid behind drawn curtains. Yet, the human spirit in the city proved stronger than the fear Rader tried to leave behind. Slowly, the community began to reclaim its history from the shadow of the killer. They focused on remembering the bright lives of the 10 victims, refusing to let a cruel man be the only story their city would ever tell. The fall of Dennis Rader stands as a stark, universal warning about the blinding nature of pride. It shows how a person can build an entire life on a foundation of lies, only to have it crumble because they cannot resist the urge to boast. This is a truth seen across human history, from ancient myths to modern courtrooms. When someone believes they are untouchable, they stop paying attention to the details. The very arrogance that makes them feel powerful is exactly what digs their grave, exposing them to the justice they thought they could outrun. While Rader's ego gave police the digital map, science provided the unbreakable lock. Investigators used a medical clinic's tissue sample from Rader's daughter to run a familial DNA test. This was the silent, undeniable witness that connected the church president directly to the crime scenes of the past. The genetic match was a mathematical certainty. It stripped away any chance of a denial or an alibi. The DNA proved that the man who sat in the church pews was the exact same man who left his biological trace on the victims decades earlier, turning a cold case into a closed case overnight. For the families of the victims, the courtroom offered a heavy, bittersweet finality. They sat in the gallery, finally able to look at the man who had torn their worlds apart. For 30 years, they had carried the agonizing weight of unanswered questions and the fear that justice would never arrive. Hearing him plead guilty could never erase the empty chairs at their dinner tables or bring back the years stolen by grief. But watching him be led away in chains provided a profound sense of relief. The monster was named, he was caged, and he would never have the power to hurt another family again. Today, Dennis Rader sits in a concrete cell, locked away in solitary confinement for the rest of his natural life. He is stripped of his trophies, his audience, and his control. Yet, his story remains a dark obsession for those who study the fractured minds of violent criminals. Even behind bars, he serves as a chilling case study of human deception. He is the ultimate proof that the most dangerous threats do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they look exactly like the man next door, waiting for the moment they can no longer hide their own dark pride. The most disturbing part of the BTK story is not just the violence, but the man behind it. Dennis Rader was not a monster hiding in a dark cave. He was a husband, a father, a church leader, and a Boy Scout volunteer. He walked the same streets as everyone else in Wichita, smiling at neighbors and enforcing local rules as a compliance officer. This double life creates a deep, unsettling fear. How could someone do such terrible things and then sit down for a family dinner? It shatters the comforting idea that evil always looks evil. The chilling truth of Dennis Rader is that the worst kind of danger can wear the most ordinary face, hiding in plain sight right next door. The hunt for this ordinary-looking killer changed the way police work. For decades, the BTK case was a frustrating puzzle with missing pieces. But as the years passed, investigators did not just wait, they adapted. The long delay forced law enforcement to look at old evidence with fresh eyes and new tools. When Rader finally resurfaced in 2004, police were ready with modern methods that did not exist in the 1970s. The case became a turning point for cold case teams everywhere. It proved that no matter how much time goes by, advancements in technology and a refusal to give up can eventually break down the walls a killer builds around themselves. Even with the case closed, dark mysteries remain. Knowing how he was caught does not fully answer why he did it. The human mind struggles to understand the sheer depth of his deception. What makes a person crave such brutal control over others while pretending to be a pillar of the community? These questions linger long after the prison doors lock. Rader's ability to switch his empathy off completely leaves a cold shadow over the human experience. It forces us to ask unsettling questions about the nature of evil and the terrifying capacity for a human being to completely mask their true self. The final act of this long nightmare played out in a bright, quiet courtroom. When Dennis Rader finally stood before a judge, the grand mask he wore for 30 years was gone. He was forced to detail his crimes out loud, stripping away the dark mystery he had built around himself. The families of the victims sat just feet away, listening to the brutal truth. The judge handed down 10 consecutive life sentences. It was a heavy final blow that ensured Rader would never take another step as a free man. For the city of Wichita and the families who had suffered so long, the sentence delivered a profound sense of justice. The boogeyman was real, but he was finally caged. Today, the story of the BTK killer stands as a massive lesson in criminal history. Law enforcement academies and psychological experts study every detail of his actions. They look at how he operated, how he hid, and most importantly, how his massive ego finally brought him down. His legacy is a dark map of human flaws. It shows future detectives exactly what to look for when hunting a serial predator. The case stands as a permanent reminder that even the most careful criminals have a weakness, and that darkness, no matter how well hidden, will eventually be forced into the light. This story hits close to home because it changes how we view the world around us. The fact that Rader blended in so perfectly serves as a harsh warning. It reminds us that hidden threats do not always announce themselves. Sometimes they are the people who seem the most normal, the ones who blend quietly into the background of our daily lives. We all have a deep human need to feel safe in our own homes and neighborhoods. The BTK case shattered that feeling for an entire city. It teaches a hard lesson about vigilance, reminding us that protecting our communities means paying attention to the quiet details and never assuming that a smiling face guarantees a safe heart. The exact way Rader was caught is a perfect example of his own trap. He sent a purple floppy disk to a local television station, believing he was smarter than the police. He actually asked the police if a floppy disk could be traced, and when they lied and said no, he believed them. He trusted his own brilliance so much that he accepted their word without question. That single piece of plastic held a hidden digital footprint. Investigators quickly found a deleted document on the disk, traced to a church computer and a user named Dennis. His arrogant need to taunt the media handed the police the exact key they needed. He thought he was pulling the strings, but he was actually walking right into a digital snare. At his core, Rader was driven by a desperate need for attention. His ego demanded an audience. He could not stand the thought that the world might forget about the BTK killer. This deep, twisted hunger for validation was stronger than his desire to stay free. This is a profound human flaw that completely destroyed his careful planning. He wanted the fame, the fear, and the front-page headlines. In the end, his own pride was the loudest voice in his head. His desperate need to be seen as a criminal mastermind is exactly what exposed him as a foolish, aging man making a fatal mistake. The tragedy of his victims is made even worse by how carefully he planned every move. These were not sudden, angry outbursts. Rader stalked his targets for months, learning their routines and mapping out their homes. He prepared kits with tools and ropes, treating his horrific acts like a dark, twisted project. This chilling precision required a massive amount of human effort and focus. He spent hours setting up his crimes, making sure every detail was perfect for his own sick satisfaction. Understanding this methodical nature makes his eventual capture through a simple, careless computer mistake feel even more significant. The man who planned everything perfectly was finally undone by his own blind pride. The ultimate shock for the people of Wichita was not just that the killer was finally caught, but who the killer turned out to be. Dennis Rader was not a drifter hiding in the shadows of the city limits. He was a husband, a father, a president of his church congregation, and a local compliance officer who walked the streets in a uniform. This revelation created a deep, sickening sense of betrayal that rippled through every neighborhood. The monster who had haunted their worst nightmares was the same man who handed out bulletins on Sunday mornings and led Boy Scout troops on weekend camping trips. It forced the entire community to face the unsettling truth that pure evil can easily hide behind a perfectly ordinary, friendly smile. The timeline of his crimes reveals a staggering double life that spanned more than 3 decades. He claimed his first 4 victims in 1974, walking into a family home and destroying it, before returning to his own quiet domestic routine. Over the next 17 years, he would strike again and again, carefully spacing out his murders while simultaneously climbing the ranks of local community organizations. He built a thick wall between his horrific acts and his public persona, managing to keep both lives completely separate for a very long time. While police searched desperately for a violent psychopath, Rader was busy writing local ordinances and enforcing leash laws in his neighborhood. This parallel existence allowed his reign of terror to stretch on for years, leaving investigators constantly chasing a ghost who was actually hiding in plain sight. Against this phantom, generations of law enforcement officers poured their lives into finding answers. Detectives worked through weekends, holidays, and their own retirements, refusing to let the cold trails defeat them. They kept the files open on their desks, constantly reviewing old crime scene photos and reading past witness statements, hoping to catch a single missed detail. Their dedication was fueled by a deep personal commitment to the victims and a strict refusal to let a predator win. Even when the leads dried up and the public slowly moved on, these investigators carried the heavy weight of the unsolved cases with them every single day. The frustration of empty answers only sharpened their resolve to eventually bring the killer out of the dark and into a courtroom. What finally broke the stalemate was not a brilliant new investigative theory, but the killer's own desperate need for attention. Dennis Rader could not stand the thought of the world forgetting his name or giving someone else credit for his horrific work. His letters and packages sent to local media were not just sick taunts, but a twisted way for him to claim absolute ownership over the fear he had created. He viewed these communications as a grand game of cat and mouse, fully believing he was much smarter than the police who were hunting him. This immense arrogance convinced him that he could safely reach out from the shadows without ever leaving a trace of his real identity. He thought he was untouchable, but this overwhelming need to brag became the exact fatal mistake that would bring his entire secret world crashing down. Before that downfall, his need to boast kept an entire city locked in a state of profound, exhausting fear. Parents checked the locks on their doors multiple times a night, and neighbors looked at strangers with deep suspicion. The gnawing anxiety of knowing a serial killer was actively watching the community changed the way people lived their daily lives. It is a unique kind of psychological torture to share your city with an unknown predator who promises to strike again. The letters published in the local newspaper served as constant, terrifying reminders that the danger was never truly gone. Every shadow held the potential of a threat, and the basic feeling of safety was completely stripped away from the people of Wichita for years. The turning point arrived when modern science collided with his outdated sense of superiority. Rader sent a floppy disk to a local television station, genuinely believing the police when they previously told him through a newspaper ad that it could not be traced. He assumed he was mastering a new form of digital communication, totally unaware of the hidden data embedded deep inside the file. Investigators immediately analyzed the disk and found a deleted digital footprint known as metadata, which pointed directly to a church computer and a user named Dennis. This single piece of hidden electronic evidence was the massive breakthrough the police had been waiting decades to find. It was a clear triumph of modern forensic technology slicing right through a killer's massive ego. Behind the triumph of the investigation lies the devastating human cost that can never be undone. 10 completely innocent lives were taken, leaving behind shattered families who were forced to navigate decades of unimaginable grief. Birthdays, graduations, and quiet family dinners were forever marked by empty chairs and the haunting memory of how their loved ones were stolen. The capture of the killer did not erase the deep scars carried by the children, siblings, and parents left behind. Their personal stories are permanently tied to his horrific actions, carrying a weight of sorrow that no court verdict can ever fully lift. The true legacy of this case is found in their enduring pain and the irreplaceable holes left in the fabric of their families. With the suspect finally in custody, the legal system geared up to ensure he would never walk free again. Prosecutors built an ironclad strategy, relying heavily on the massive mountain of evidence Rader had willingly provided through his own taunting communications. They matched the digital footprint from the floppy disk directly to DNA evidence, creating a chain of proof that was absolutely impossible to deny. The goal of the prosecution was not just to win a conviction, but to firmly establish the truth for the victims and the terrified community. They prepared to present every chilling detail in open court, stripping away the killer's mysterious persona to reveal the pathetic, cruel reality of his actions. This legal approach was designed to lock him away forever and finally close the darkest chapter in the city's history. The evidence prepared for trial exposed a systematic and highly organized playbook of violence. Rader treated his crimes like military operations, conducting extensive surveillance on his targets and preparing physical kits to bring to the scenes. He documented everything with a chilling precision, turning his horrific acts into a twisted hobby that he carefully managed in his spare time. His meticulous planning fed directly into his massive arrogance, making him believe his methods were completely flawless. He assumed that because he followed his own strict rules, he would remain permanently untouchable by the law. But it was exactly this rigid, obsessive documentation and his overwhelming pride in his own playbook that gave investigators everything they needed to put him behind bars. Before the era of modern genetics, the hunt for a phantom relied on shoe leather and sheer human endurance. Detectives in the 1970s and 1980s did not have a magic swab to reveal a killer's identity. Instead, they built their cases on scattered witness accounts, blurred composite sketches, and the painstaking collection of physical items left at the scene. Every piece of paper, every knot tied in a rope, and every footprint was studied under a magnifying glass, hoping it would point to a name. It was a grueling process of elimination, heavily dependent on circumstantial evidence and gut instinct. Investigators spent thousands of hours knocking on doors, interviewing neighbors, and chasing down hundreds of dead-end tips. They were searching for a needle in a massive haystack, armed only with basic tools and the hope that the killer would eventually make a fatal, human mistake in the physical world. But the killer was not just taking lives, he was actively terrorizing the minds of everyone left behind. His letters and poems, sent to local authorities and news outlets, transformed him from a hidden criminal into a terrifying, almost mythical figure. He gave himself a name, and that name became a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread that covered the entire city of Wichita. Every time a new message arrived, a fresh wave of panic washed over the public. People locked their doors, bought alarm systems, and looked at their neighbors with deep, unsettling suspicion. The taunts were designed to inflict maximum psychological damage, making families feel that no matter what they did, an invisible monster was always watching from the dark, ready to strike at any moment. The turning point finally arrived decades later, not through a dramatic shootout, but through a quiet, invisible trail of digital data. Investigators recovered a purple floppy disk that the killer had arrogantly mailed to a local television station. When digital forensic experts examined the disk, they found hidden, deleted files that the sender believed were gone forever. Deep inside the disk's code, a piece of hidden text pointed to a specific church and a user named Dennis. This crucial digital fingerprint, combined with a vehicle description from an earlier sighting, suddenly narrowed the massive suspect list down to one very specific individual. The invisible phantom suddenly had a face, a job, and an address. The reality of who Dennis Rader was shocked investigators to their core. He was not a drifter hiding in the shadows. He was a married man, a father, a Boy Scout leader, and the president of his church congregation. He walked the bright, quiet streets of his suburban neighborhood every single day, completely camouflaged by the mundane routines of ordinary life. The sheer audacity required to sit in a church pew on a Sunday morning, knowing the horrors he had committed, revealed a chilling level of psychological separation. He had built a perfect, invisible wall between his brutal crimes and his life as a respected community member. This terrifying ability to compartmentalize his existence was exactly what allowed him to hide in plain sight for over 30 years. Yet, the very things Rader used to feed his ego became the breadcrumbs that led to his downfall. He could not resist the urge to communicate, sending a steady stream of letters, puzzles, and eventually that fateful floppy disk. He viewed these items not as dangerous evidence, but as personal trophies of his superior intellect meant to mock the police who could not catch him. Each package he mailed contained tiny fragments of his life, from the specific way he spelled words to the exact brand of photocopier he used. His overwhelming arrogance blinded him to the fact that he was handing investigators the very tools they needed to dismantle his entire operation. He believed he was leaving behind a legacy of terror, when in reality, he was slowly writing his own arrest warrant. When the arrest was finally announced, the news hit the community like a physical blow. The profound realization that the monster they had feared for decades was actually the man who enforced local pet ordinances shattered any remaining sense of security in Wichita. He had been inside their homes to check on their dogs, he had spoken to them at town meetings, and he had worshipped beside them. This revelation forced a painful, immediate reevaluation of trust across the entire city. If a brutal killer could perfectly mimic a helpful, ordinary neighbor for more than 3 decades, the basic fabric of community life felt permanently compromised. The safety of the suburbs was exposed as a fragile illusion, broken by a man who used the rules of society to hide his complete lack of humanity. Throughout this agonizing timeline, the local media served as an unintended bridge between the killer and the public. News outlets published his letters and broadcast his demands, keeping the cold case alive in the minds of the citizens. This constant coverage was exactly what Rader craved, feeding his desperate need for attention and validating his twisted sense of power. However, this intense spotlight also ensured that law enforcement could never quietly file the case away. The public pressure, driven by the media's reporting, demanded continuous action and funding for the task force. The very platform Rader used to inflate his ego ultimately kept the spotlight burning bright enough for investigators to finally catch his fatal mistake. At the core of Rader's long reign of terror was a deeply ingrained, almost delusional belief in his own mental superiority. He genuinely thought he was playing a high-stakes game of chess against opponents who were simply not smart enough to understand his moves. He viewed the police not as a threat, but as an audience for his dark brilliance. This inflated self-perception made the nature of his capture profoundly humiliating for him. He was not taken down in a battle of wits, but because he believed a simple lie told by a detective about floppy disk security. The ultimate humbling of his massive ego came from his own profound ignorance of modern technology, a fatal flaw born entirely from his unchecked arrogance. The final nail in the coffin was not a confession, but the cold, hard certainty of forensic science. Once detectives had Rader's name, they needed absolute proof, which they obtained by securing a medical DNA sample from his daughter. When scientists compared that familial DNA to the genetic material left at a crime scene decades earlier, the match was undeniable. This microscopic evidence provided an irrefutable biological link that no amount of lies or manipulation could explain away. The science stripped Rader of his remaining power, cutting straight through 30 years of careful deception and carefully planned alibis. It was the ultimate weapon of truth, ensuring that the man who thought he was untouchable would finally face the absolute weight of justice. For 30 years, an open wound festered in the heart of Kansas. The families left behind did not just want answers, they desperately needed a physical, undeniable end to their nightmare. Justice is a deep human hunger, a need to see the architect of so much pain finally pulled into the light and stripped of his power. When the courtroom doors finally closed on Dennis Rader, that hunger met its first real meal in decades. The sentencing did not erase the empty chairs at dinner tables or the years of stolen birthdays, but it offered a heavy, concrete truth. The monster was real, he was caught, and he would never walk free in the sun again. The irony of that courtroom victory is how easily it could have never happened if not for the killer's own towering ego. Rader felt ignored by the press as the years went on, a silence his pride simply could not handle. He chose to reach out again, to taunt the police, believing he was still the smartest man in the room. That desperate need for attention became his fatal flaw. He started sending packages, letters, and puzzles, trusting that his old rules of the game still applied in a modern world. He made basic human mistakes, blinded by the belief that a small-town police force could never outsmart a criminal mastermind of his own making. The reality of his mind was fully exposed when he finally sat at the defense table and spoke. Hearing him confess was not a moment of relief, but a plunge into ice water for everyone listening in the gallery. He described taking human lives with the casual, flat tone of a man reading a grocery list. He detailed his dark fantasies and his brutal methods without a single tremor of regret in his voice. That cold, calculated recounting brought a fresh wave of horror to the courtroom, stripping away any illusion of human empathy. It proved exactly what the investigators had chased for so long, a predator totally empty of a soul. While his mind was stuck in the past, the tools used to trap him belonged to a new era. The world had quietly transformed while he hid in plain sight, replacing old filing cabinets with digital tracking and microscopic science. Technology gave detectives a new lens, allowing them to see the invisible threads he left behind. DNA testing could now pull a perfect match from a tiny, decades-old drop of evidence. Digital forensics could trace a single file back to the exact computer that created it. The very science he ignored became the absolute wall that cut off his escape, turning his own taunts into a perfect map leading straight to his front door. Yet even with the cell door locked forever, the shadow he cast over Wichita refuses to fully fade. You can still feel the echo of those 30 years of terror in the way people double-check their deadbolts at night. Entire generations grew up looking over their shoulders, taught by their parents that monsters do not just live in stories. The city carries a permanent scar, a heavy memory of the time when anyone walking down the street could be the phantom they feared. That kind of profound, shared trauma weaves itself into the dirt and the buildings of a town. It is a harsh lesson in survival, a reminder of the terrible cost paid by the innocent. Pushing through that dark era required a special kind of endurance from the men and women wearing the badge. Detectives spent their entire careers chasing ghosts, passing thick case files down to younger officers when they retired. They worked through dead ends, false leads, and mocking letters, fueled by a quiet, unbreakable promise to the victims. That human commitment was the true engine of the investigation, keeping the fire alive when the trail went ice cold. They sorted through thousands of tips, never losing faith that the killer would eventually slip. Their patience was a heavy burden, but it built the trap that finally snapped shut when the moment arrived. The trigger for that trap was not a stroke of genius, but the killer's own blinding vanity. Rader viewed his arrogance as a shield, a sign of his absolute control over the city and the police. In reality, that massive ego was a deep, psychological crack in his armor, a hunger that made him reckless. He needed the world to fear him again, to recognize his self-appointed brilliance. That desperate need for applause clouded his judgment, pushing him to take risks a truly careful man would avoid. His belief that he was untouchable became the exact weakness that pulled him out of the shadows and into the harsh light of a cell. That weakness took a very physical form in the final package he sent to a local news station. Inside was a floppy disk, a piece of technology he blindly trusted to protect his identity. He even asked the police, through a classified ad, if a disk could be traced, and he actually believed them when they lied and said no. The moment detectives plugged that disk into a computer, his entire secret life unraveled in seconds. Hidden deep inside the file was a piece of digital history, a small tag of metadata pointing directly to a local church and a user named Dennis. Those tiny digital breadcrumbs were the absolute, undeniable proof that the Phantom was just a foolish man making a fatal error. When the handcuffs finally clicked, the true horror for the community was not just his capture, but his identity. The monster who haunted their nightmares was not a stranger hiding in an alley, but the man who served as president of his church council. He was the local compliance officer, the guy who checked on stray dogs and tall grass in the neighborhood. The realization that pure evil was mowing the lawn next door shattered whatever fragile sense of safety the town had left. It forced everyone to look at their neighbors, their friends, and their community leaders with a sudden, chilling doubt. The ultimate terror of the BTK case was the brutal truth that a killer can look exactly like one of us. The pattern of his letters formed a clear timeline of a man desperate for the spotlight. When the city began to heal, or when the news cycle moved on to other stories, the letters would suddenly appear. He mailed poems, puzzles, and twisted claims of responsibility just to force his way back onto the front page. This cycle of silence and sudden noise was a trap of his own making. He could not stand being forgotten. Every time the police seemed to hit a dead end, his deep need for attention pushed him to reach out again. leaving a fresh trail of clues each time he tried to prove how smart he was. For the people living in Wichita, those letters were a heavy, dark cloud that refused to clear. Parents double-checked their locks every night, and children grew up learning to fear shadows in their own homes. The simple act of answering the door or walking to the car carried a quiet, constant weight of terror. It was a low-level anxiety that settled deep into the bones of the city. Decades passed, but the invisible threat never truly faded away. Families lived with the terrible knowledge that a monster was walking their streets, shopping in their stores, and watching them from the dark. When the police finally zeroed in on Dennis Rader, they needed more than just a trail of floppy disks and letters to lock him away forever. They needed absolute, undeniable proof. That proof came in the form of a tiny, invisible code hidden inside human cells. Investigators took a medical sample from his daughter and compared it to the evidence left behind at the crime scenes decades earlier. The match was perfect. This was not just a strong lead, it was the definitive scientific truth that tied him directly to the horror he had caused, closing the cold case once and for all. But the only reason the police knew where to look was because his ego had grown completely out of control. He truly believed he was untouchable. He thought he could play a cat-and-mouse game with the media, dropping packages in public parks and slipping discs into the mail without ever being caught. This supreme arrogance became his fatal flaw. He viewed the police as beneath his intellect, completely ignoring the reality of modern science and digital tracking. He walked right out into the open, blinded by his own pride, convinced that the rules of the real world simply did not apply to him. Taking him down required a massive, silent effort from the men and women working the case. Once the digital clue pointed to his church, they did not rush in and risk losing him. They built a solid wall of evidence, piece by piece, checking records, tracking his daily routine, and waiting for the perfect moment. It was a masterclass in patience and precision. Detectives worked long nights, matching old case files with new data, ensuring every single detail was legally tight. They knew they only had one shot to pull this man from his ordinary life and put him behind bars, and they refused to make a single mistake. When the news broke that the killer had finally been caught, a massive wave of relief washed over Wichita. People stood in their yards and cried, hugging their neighbors as the long nightmare finally ended. The heavy, invisible weight that had crushed the city for over 30 years was suddenly gone. Doors could finally be unlocked. The dark corners of the city no longer held the same terrifying power. It was the first time in an entire generation that the people of Wichita could truly take a deep breath, safe in the knowledge that the monster was locked in a cage. The year 2005 will always stand as the turning point for the city and for the history of criminal justice. It marked the exact moment when the past stopped bleeding into the present. Decades of unsolved grief and cold case files were finally closed, bringing a hard-fought end to the terror. This capture proved that time does not erase the truth. Even after 30 years of hiding in plain sight, the past caught up with him. That single day in 2005 shifted the story from a mystery of a phantom killer to the final, pathetic reality of an ordinary man facing justice. Deep inside his mind, a bitter war had raged between two completely opposite desires. Part of him desperately wanted to remain a ghost, safe and hidden in his quiet family life. But an even darker part of him craved the sick glory of being known as a terrifying mastermind. In the end, his hunger for fame was stronger than his instinct to survive. He simply could not stand the thought of someone else writing his story, or worse, the world forgetting him entirely. That deep human flaw tipped the scales, pushing him to reach out to the police and hand them the keys to his own destruction. The trap that finally caught him was built entirely on cold, hard facts. It started with the hidden digital code on a floppy disk, which pointed directly to a computer at his local church. From there, the net tightened through the careful science of genetic testing. These objective truths stripped away all of his lies and mind games. The digital footprints proved he wrote the letters, and the DNA proved he committed the crimes. His subjective belief that he was a genius was completely destroyed by the quiet, undeniable power of forensic science. The names carved into stone across Wichita cemeteries are not just markers of a crime spree. They are Josephine Otero, a bright 11-year-old girl who loved her dog, and Shirley Vian, a mother trying to protect her young children. When the courtroom doors finally closed, the focus had to shift away from the man in the dock and back to the empty chairs left at family dinner tables. Remembering them means seeing the vibrant lives they lived before a stranger walked through their doors. Catherine Bright was just starting her adult life, and Dolores Davis was enjoying her quiet retirement. The true weight of this history lives in the gardens they planted, the children they raised, and the quiet, ordinary moments that were stolen from them. Dennis Rader built his entire identity on the belief that he was smarter than the detectives hunting him. He spent 30 years reading books on police tactics, convinced he had mastered the game of cat and mouse. But this deep pride created a massive blind spot, making him think the rules of modern science simply did not apply to him. He failed to grasp how fast technology was moving, trusting his own outdated knowledge over the reality of the 21st century. When he asked police if a floppy disk could be traced, he actually believed they would tell him the truth. His desperate need to be known as a genius was the exact flaw that made him hand over the digital map straight to his own front door. The floppy disk that ended the chase changed how police departments across the country handled digital evidence. The case became a mandatory textbook example for cybercrime units, proving that hidden data inside a simple Word document could break a cold case wide open. Detectives learned they no longer had to wait for a fingerprint at a crime scene when a digital footprint was hiding inside a computer. Today, digital tracking is the standard first step in major investigations. Law enforcement agencies built entire labs dedicated to pulling hidden author names and deleted files from devices. The capture proved that a killer's need to communicate will almost always leave an electronic trail that they cannot easily erase. For the people of Wichita, the arrest brought an end to the fear, but it also forced a harsh new reality on the community. Neighbors had to accept that the monster who haunted their nightmares was the same man who installed their home security alarms. The trust they placed in community leaders and church presidents was deeply shaken, leaving a lasting scar on how people viewed the quiet men in their neighborhoods. Families of the victims finally received the answers they had begged for, yet the truth offered no easy peace. They learned the brutal details of their loved ones' final moments from the killer's own mouth in a cold, matter-of-fact tone. The closure of the legal system could never fix the deep emotional damage done to the children who grew up without mothers and fathers. On August 18, 2005, the sentencing of Dennis Rader destroyed the old myth of the brilliant, untouchable criminal mastermind. The public watched a balding, ordinary man stand in a Kansas courtroom and list his crimes like he was reading a grocery list. It stripped away the dark glamour that movies and books often gave to serial killers, revealing nothing but a pathetic, cruel man. The shockwave of that day changed how society talks about true crime. People stopped looking for evil geniuses hiding in the shadows and started looking at the boring, everyday cruelty happening in plain sight. The courtroom cameras showed the world that true monsters do not have fangs or hide in dark alleys. They sit in church pews and complain about neighborhood rules. Even with a full confession and a mountain of evidence, one chilling question remains firmly unanswered. Experts and psychologists still debate how a human mind can completely separate a loving family life from a secret life of brutal murder. The medical records and brain scans offer no clear reason why a father could tuck his children into bed and then hunt a stranger hours later. There is no single trauma or brain injury in his past that perfectly explains the violent split in his personality. Science can track his DNA, and computers can track his floppy disk, but no tool can map the exact moment his empathy turned off completely. The system caught the killer, but it still cannot fully explain the dark, empty space inside his mind. The physical landscape of the city still holds quiet reminders of what happened long after the yellow police tape was taken down. Houses where the crimes took place were bought, sold, or torn down, leaving empty lots that hold a heavy silence in busy neighborhoods. The city moved forward, building new parks and roads, but those specific street corners will always carry a hidden weight for the people who remember. Law enforcement archives now house thousands of pages of his letters and drawings, locked away in climate-controlled rooms. These boxes of evidence sit on metal shelves, serving as a dark museum of a closed era. The physical proof of his terror is trapped in cardboard, finally stripped of its power to hurt anyone else. The officers who worked the case for decades carried the burden of those crime scenes into their retirement. Many of the original detectives spent their entire careers chasing ghosts, missing family dinners and losing sleep over a voice on a tape recording. When the cuffs finally clicked, the relief was heavy, mixed with the exhaustion of a 30-year marathon. For the new generation of police, the story serves as a strict warning about the dangers of tunnel vision. They are taught to look past the obvious suspects and the clear profiles, knowing that the killer might be the man offering them a cup of coffee. The human cost of the long hunt forever changed the culture inside the precinct walls. The final legal victory relied on a simple piece of paper, a church meeting agenda found on a deleted computer drive. This single document proved that the most complex, long-running murder investigations often turn on the smallest, most ordinary mistakes. The legal system did not need to prove he was a monster. They only had to prove he was the man who used the church computer. The court record stands as a lasting proof that extreme arrogance is always a fatal flaw. The man who spent decades building a myth of being an unstoppable force was undone by his own basic lack of tech skills. The law finally caught him, not because the police played his twisted game, but because he forgot how the real world actually works. Even with Dennis Rader locked away in a concrete cell, one strange question remains buried in the case files. It is hard to fully understand why a man who spent 30 years carefully hiding his tracks suddenly trusted a simple newspaper ad. He asked the police if a floppy disk could be traced back to him, and they answered him in the local paper, telling a direct lie by saying it was safe. We still cannot settle if this was just a moment of extreme foolishness or the final result of a mind poisoned by its own huge ego. He had controlled the game for so long that he actually believed the police were playing by his rules. That blind trust in his own cleverness is a gap in logic that no psychological profile can perfectly explain. The shock of his capture changed how detectives hunt predators across the country. His downfall became the ultimate proof that invisible digital footprints are just as real as a bloody fingerprint left on a glass. Law enforcement agencies everywhere started building entire units dedicated purely to pulling hidden data out of everyday computer files, knowing that a killer's pride could be trapped inside a single saved document. This shift brought a deep sense of power back to the investigators who had spent decades chasing ghosts. Knowing that a monster could be undone by his own need to boast gave police a new kind of hope. The methods used to pull his first name from that church computer file are now standard practice, ensuring that the arrogance of future killers will be the very thing that locks them in a cage. For the families in Wichita, the end of the manhunt brought a heavy, complicated quiet. They finally had the true answer to who took their loved ones, but they also had to live with the harsh reality that the killer was just a normal man living right down the street. The city had to heal from the terrifying fact that a monster had served as a local code inspector and a church leader, hiding his dark life in plain sight while an entire community locked their doors. For the families left behind, the arrest did not erase 30 long years of pain. Instead, it forced a harsh new reality on the entire city. People had to face the chilling fact that the monster who took their loved ones was not a shadow in the night, but a man who walked their streets, checked their fences, and sat beside them in church. The deepest scar left on the community was the breaking of basic trust. They learned the hard way that pure evil does not always look like a villain, but often wears the boring, everyday face of a neighbor. The sudden fall of this man completely changed how detectives hunt criminals who hide in the open. It proved that a killer's massive pride is always his biggest blind spot. For decades, investigators focused mostly on physical clues left behind in a room. But the hidden code on that floppy disk showed the world that a digital footprint leaves a trail that cannot be wiped away. The lasting shockwave of this case created a new rule for law enforcement everywhere. It proved that no matter how clever a predator believes he is, the modern technology he uses to brag will eventually become the exact trap that locks his cage. Deep inside a Wichita evidence room sits a single purple floppy disk, its obsolete plastic casing resting quietly in the dark. It is a remarkably small and ordinary object to hold the weight of 10 stolen lives and 30 years of fear. Yet, it remains the ultimate monument to a predator who believed he was untouchable, brought down entirely by his own desperate, blinding need to be recognized. Visit our website at h2c Tiggio Court TV. Visit our website at h2ctiggiocourttv.com/